What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're looking at a beautiful game where Magnus Carlsen shows Praggnanandhaa why he is still the GOAT. Now, this game took place in the 2022 Meltwater Tour Finals, back when Praggnanandhaa wasn't even rated 2700 GM, but despite the rating difference, Praggnanandhaa gave Magnus the fight of his life. So with that in mind, let's dive right into this video where Magnus Carlsen shows Praggnanandhaa why he is the GOAT. Alright, in this game, Magnus opens 1b3, a very disrespectful opening, and Praggnanandhaa goes d5. Then we have bishop b2, knight to f6, Praggnanandhaa playing very solid so far in this game. Then we have knight f3, c5, e3, and now finally the move e6. So Praggnanandhaa heading for sort of a queen's gambit decline style setup here as black with those pawns on e6, d5, and c5, and the knight on f6. Meanwhile, Magnus has the typical Nimzo-Larsen setup with the bishop on b2, the pawns on b3 and e3, and so on. Now, how does Magnus want to play this? Well, there are a variety of ways you can play. You can go for a fast d4, c4, even a g3, bishop g2 setup is technically possible. In today's game, though, he does go d4, playing classically, striking in the center. Now, Praggnanandhaa, in return, he's got a million different options here as black. For example, you can go bishop b7, bishop d6, c takes d4, heading for a reversed Carlsbad structure is possible, and you can also go, say, knight c6 or even a6. Now, in the game, he does go bishop d6. That is the most active square for the bishop, but the drawback that over, say, I don't know, knight c6 or another waiting move is that white can go d takes c5, and then black does technically waste a tempo going bishop d6 and then to c5, wasting two tempos with that bishop just to win that pawn on c5. And sure enough here, that is what Magnus does. So he goes d takes c5, opting not to develop passively. For example, he could wait. He could go, say, c4, bishop d3, knight b d2. Those are the other main options. But instead, in the game, d takes c5, played by Magnus. Now we have bishop takes c5. Obviously, the bishop was under attack, so bishop takes c5 makes a lot of sense. Now we have c4, castles, and finally the move knight b d2 for Magnus. So here Magnus, he is delaying the development of that bishop on f1. If he wants, say, bishop e2 right here, that would be a massive mistake, as then black can take on c4, and white will not have much of an advantage, as then if he recaptures on c4 later, he does waste, if I can draw arrows correctly, he does waste one tempo, going to e2 and then c4 with that bishop. So knight b d2 is designed to not waste a tempo that way, and also he's trying to clog up that d file. That way, if black does take on c4 later, the queens do stay on the board as they can't attack each other yet. All right, now Praggnanandhaa, he responds, queen d7, getting his queen off that d file. The point being, he wants to go rook d8, lining up his rook with the white queen on d1 and applying more pressure on his position. Of course, there were other ideas. b6, knight d7, and knight c6 were also possible. All right, now here Magnus, how does he want to continue? Well, I would have thought he would go, say, queen c2, something like that, getting his queen off the d-file, getting out of the way of the future rook d8 idea. But instead here, he does go a3, intending a fast b4, and that is a pretty typical idea in a lot of queen's gambit style structures, especially the queen's gambit accepted. But here Praggnanandhaa, he is ready, and he does clamp down on the queen side immediately with the very precise move a5, bringing the a-pawn into the game, clamping down on b4, stopping that b4 advance as you would lose the pawn on the spot. All right, now with that in mind, how is Magnus going to continue? Well, once again, it is in his best interest to delay the development of the bishop on f1. Instead of that, you want to go queen to c2. Again, that way if black does take on c4, you can recapture on c4 in one tempo with the bishop. So overall, queen c2 would be the best way to go here. But instead, he goes bishop d3, and this is an immediate mistake. And here Praggnanandhaa is very fast to punish it. He does go d takes c4. Now we have knight takes c4 from white. And now the placement of the knight on c4 and the bishop on d3 is potentially a little bit awkward for white. And here black is going to have a way to immediately punish the awkward placement of those pieces. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the strongest idea for Praggnanandhaa here to seize the initiative as black already on move 11. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, the key idea for black is going to be b5, gaining space on the queen side, driving back that knight, and once the knight moves, then you can go b4, gaining even more space and getting a permanent lockdown on the queen side. That would be excellent for black. Black may even have an advantage there. Instead, though, in the game, Praggnanandhaa playing it solid against the GOAT Magnus Carlsen, he does go b6, intending a very fast bishop b7, applying pressure on this diagonal. All right, now here, Magnus, how does he want to continue? Well, it turns out the computer says there is a diabolical way to take advantage of this weak move b6. You can actually go g4 here. The point being, if black takes, you go rook g1, and all of a sudden you have a very strong attack on the king side with the rook and the two bishops slicing down on the king side. Instead, here Magnus does castle, so the opportunity for g4 was there, but now with the king on g1, that is not going to be the case. And now here Praggnanandhaa just continues, knight d7, a very solid move, perhaps intending bishop b7, rook c8, rook d8, and so on. And all of his pieces would be on pretty good squares overall. All right, now here, Magnus, he continues, knight d4, centralizing his knight, an interesting move. We'll have to wait and see what he has in mind with that. All right, Praggnanandhaa, bishop b7, taking control of the long diagonal, very, very solid. And now here, Magnus, he shows his idea, the idea behind knight d4 played earlier. He actually goes bishop e2. Now, this move is very important with that knight on d4 instead of f3. If you know Magnus, you may think he's intending bishop f3, challenging the black light squared bishop on b7, and indeed, that is his plan in the game. Here, Praggnanandhaa goes knight d4, jumping in with the knight, and sure enough, bishop f3 is the move, again, trying to seize control of this long diagonal. So, Magnus here, playing a very weird, slow opening, but it is slowly starting to come together, and we are starting to see his plan. But here, Praggnanandhaa, he is not done. He goes knight d to f6, and now both the knights on f6 and e4 are excellently placed. Praggnanandhaa, if anything, still has a little bit of an advantage here. His pieces are just a little bit better placed, especially those knights. All right, now here, Magnus, queen c2 is the move, putting more pressure on that knight on e4. However, the problem with this move is black can just go rook to c8, lining up the rook with the queen, and that is what he does. And now there are going to be a lot of tactical ideas based on perhaps b5, trying to free up the c-file, getting those pieces moving off. For example, b5, if the knight moves, I don't know, knight takes a4, then bishop takes d4 would be strong with a discovered attack on the queen. Therefore here, Magnus, he does go a4, clamping down on b5, stopping the b5 advance, making sure his knight on c4 is cemented there for now and will not have to go anywhere. All right, Praggnanandhaa, he continues, bishop d5, applying even more pressure on that knight on d5. Praggnanandhaa playing extremely well so far in this game. I think Magnus, he may be a little bit unsettled by the fact that his opponent, rated 200 points lower than him, is actually hanging on so far in this game. All right, Magnus continues, rook a to c1, sliding the rook over onto the c-file. Praggnanandhaa goes h6, a waiting move, controlling g5. Nothing wrong with that. Now we have queen e2, rook fd8, and rook fd1. Now, get a load of this. Here in this position, both sides have a relatively symmetrical position, with the exception of that pawn on h6. Literally all of these pawns are symmetrically placed. The knights on f6 and e4, whereas the knights on d4 and c4 are very active. The bishops for both sides are active. And of course, both sides have their queens on the e-file and their rooks on the d-file and the c-file. Literally everything is about as good as you can get it. And that means things are about to get very, very heated, as neither side has any more simple improving moves. Both sides will have to find some way to increase the pressure via more active means. All right, here Praggnanandhaa is his turn to move, and he makes very good use of this move, h6. He actually goes knight to h7. Now, the idea behind this move, he wants to go knight g4, putting pressure on that bishop and supporting the knight. And at that point, you pretty much are all but guaranteed to lose that very important light squared bishop. All right, here, Magnus, seeing that's coming, he just goes bishop takes e4 right away, giving up the bishop pair. Now Praggnanandhaa will have the two Bs on e4 and c5. And according to research by Larry Kaufman, the bishop pair in a relatively open game like this one is worth about half a pawn. And that means Magnus here, he will have to fight very hard to justify his slight material deficit, that being down the bishop pair. All right, Magnus continues, knight b5, very active move, opening up the d-file. Now there is some tension on the d-file with those two rooks opposing each other. And now here Praggnanandhaa goes queen to g5. The audacity of this man, threatening checkmate on g2 in one move. Of course, Magnus being the GOAT, he will spot this. He goes f3, and yes, even though the pawn on g2 is pinned to the king, you can't go bishop takes f3, as then the queen does recapture, and you are down the bishop. Therefore, the bishop must retreat right now. Where is he going to go? In the game, here Praggnanandhaa, he takes on d1 first, rook takes, then a rook takes, and then he goes bishop d5, jumping back with the bishop and pressuring c4. Now, of course, here White would like to go e4, gaining space and driving back that bishop once again, but that is not a legal move, as then the king on g1 would be under check by the bishop on c5. Therefore, here, Magnus the GOAT will have to find some other way to proceed. In the game, he goes bishop d4, jumping up with the bishop, opposing the black bishop on c5, a perfectly fine move. Now we have bishop takes, then e takes, and then knight to f6, jumping back with the knight, jumping back into the gate. Now we have knight takes b6, Magnus winning a free pawn and forking both the rook and the bishop on d5, but it turns out this is a very critical mistake, believe it or not, and Praggnanandhaa is going to be pressing for the next few moves at least. Instead of this, here Magnus had to go either queen to d2, knight to a7, or some other weird semi-waiting move. It turns out, believe it or not, taking on b5 is a mistake because it opens up the c-file, and here Praggnanandhaa, he just flies in with the rook to c1, a very powerful move. Now, what is the threat? Well, it's very simple. Here, black is just too active. If white takes on c1, black takes back, the queen is active, hitting the king, and if you don't do that, black is going to take on b3, threaten the rook, and overall here, black is just taking control of this game despite being down a single pawn. All right, here Magnus continues, knight c4, cutting off that bishop, but here Praggnanandhaa is ready. He goes knight to h5, a critical move. That knight on b6 is no longer pressuring the bishop on d5. Therefore, the knight on s6 no longer needs to guard d5. It jumps to h5, intending knight h4, hitting the queen and hitting g2, and black would potentially have some sort of checkmating threat. This is all getting very, very dangerous, very fast. All right, here, Magnus, he takes on c1. Rook takes, then queen takes. Queen takes, hits the king on g1. The king has to move. King to f2 played in the game. And then we have bishop takes c4. Queen takes c4. And then instead of the queen trade, he keeps the queens on the board and goes queen to b2, a very strong move. And now the queen and the knight are going to synergize extremely well to put a lot of pressure on that king on f2. Now, if the king goes to say, I don't know, e1 or e3, then the pawn on g2 will fall immediately. That is something Magnus has to worry about continuously here. Now, in the game, he does not go back with the king trying to defend g2. Instead, king to e3 played in the game. And here Praggnanandhaa, he just takes on g2. So queen takes g2. He wins back the pawn. Now Magnus has 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn islands versus the 1, 2 of Praggnanandhaa. That means Praggnanandhaa has a much better pawn structure and very good chances to steal away with this win in this game. All right, now here, Magnus goes d5, breaking in the center. We have queen g1. It hits the king on the e3 square, king d3, and then here it turns out the best move for Praggnanandhaa, believe it or not, is just gobbling up that free pawn on h2, ignoring the threat on e6. Instead here, Praggnanandhaa, being very worried about d takes e6 ideas, he goes queen d1, hitting the king on d3. Now the king has to move, king e3 played in the game. Then we have queen e1, hits the king again, king d3, and it turns out queen d1 here is the right way, but instead, queen b1 played in the game, and this move is a little bit dubious. Here the king moves, king d2, and here it turns out queen b2, intending queen d5, centralizing the queen and defending e6 is the right way to go. But instead here, he actually goes e takes d5, and this is a critical mistake, as you can see by the eval bar just skyrocketing in favor of Magnus. I mean, it goes from 0 all the way to plus 2.7, 2.8. That means white is essentially up a piece here in terms of the overall advantage he has in the position. All right, now here, Magnus, queen to c8 is the move, hits the king on g8 immediately. The king has to move, king h7 played in the game, then queen to c2, sliding back with the king, or the queen, sorry, sliding back with that queen. The point being now the king on h7 and the queen on b1 are under attack. Therefore, you do have to trade queens. So queen takes, then king takes. And now here in this endgame, because these pawns on the queen side are so weak, Magnus is going to have a very significant advantage and very good winning chances, although anything can happen in this endgame. All right, it continues. King g6, marching the king. b4, gaining space. A takes b4, and now instead of, say, king b3 and king takes, here Magnus just goes a5. His plan is simple. He has the first powerful pass pawn on the queen side. He just wants to go a6, a7, and then a8, promoting to a queen. All right, Praggnanandhaa. His king is outside the square of the pawn. Therefore, the only chance is to get the knight over into the game. He starts knight f6, then a6, knight d7, a7, then knight b6. The knight, just in time, defends a8. But will that be enough? Now, king b3. Magnus bringing his king into the game as well. Praggnanandhaa marches over as well. It tries to defend. King takes, knight a8, retreating the knight, king c5, king e7, king c6, king d8, marching the king down, king b7, hits the knight. Where is the knight going to go? Well, it turns out there's very little you can do to defend that knight. Praggnanandhaa just goes f6, allowing white to take. The point being, if you take, securing the win can be a little bit complicated after, say, king does c8. At that point, the king would be essentially trapped, and black may have drawing chances. Instead here, king c6 played in the game. Then we have h5, gaining space. King takes d5. White leaving the knight alone on a8, but it turns out this is not the right way forward. All right, king d7, Praggnanandhaa getting chances in this game. King c5, g5, Praggnanandhaa intending perhaps f5, g4, and so on. Now, king d5, g4, then f takes, h takes. Now Praggnanandhaa has the pass pawn on the f file. All right, king e4, king c6, hits the knight, king c3, king b7, defending with the king. The point being, now the knight is free to enter the game. Now, king to f5, knight c7, king takes g4, knight e6, king f5, knight d4 hits the king. Now we have king e4, knight e6 retreating, h4 gaining space with the alpha 0 h pawn. Now knight g7 defending h5, stopping h5 advances. Now we have knight b5, king to a8, king to f4, king b7, king g4, king a8. Praggnanandhaa going back and forth trying to defend. Will Magnus be able to steal a win here? Let's keep going. Knight d6. King takes a7. Knight f5. Now we're down to one pawn on the king side for each side. But the problem is Praggnanandhaa, his king is so far away from the king side. It's too far away. All right, knight e6, h5, king b6, marching the king, h6, knight f8, guarding h7. Then we have knight d4, knight h7, king f5, king c5, hits the knight. Now the knight must move, but instead here, white goes king g6, attacking the knight on h7. The point being, if you take the knight, then you take the knight on h7, followed by, say, king b7, h7, h8, and you will have the queen before Praggnanandhaa. All right, now here, instead of taking the knight, here Praggnanandhaa goes knight g5. The knight is defended by the pawn, but now king takes f6, wins the pawn. Can Praggnanandhaa stop the h-pawn? I don't know. Knight h7, king g6, knight f8, king g7, and here, in this position, Praggnanandhaa, he is forced to resign. If you go to g6 or h7, you lose the knight. Instead, if you go e6, you lose the knight. Instead, if you go to d7, the only other move, if he goes there, then white just goes h7, and there is no way for that knight to control the h8 square. That means white is going to promote, he is going to get the queen, and he will win the game. Wow, what a game between Magnus the GOAT and Praggnanandhaa from the 2022 Meltwater Tour Finals. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of this crazy game between Praggnanandhaa and Magnus Carlsen. And while you're at it, check out this video right here where I cover what I think is the game of the year played in 2022 between Magnus Carlsen and Praggnanandhaa, where Praggnanandhaa sacrifices not just one rook, but two rooks against the GOAT. The audacity of Praggnanandhaa. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. It's got like 1 billion views by this point, I assume. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.